The morning sun streamed through the wide arched windows of the chapel, casting a golden glow over the pews filled with smiling faces. It was a day most would describe as flawless, a fairy tale wedding with every detail meticulously planned. The bride, Natalie, floated down the aisle in a dress that seemed to sparkle with every step, her veil trailing behind her like a soft whisper of elegance. Alex stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his best man, Ethan, leaning over with a reassuring pat on the back. "Relax," Ethan whispered, his trademark grin flashing. "She's walking toward you, not running away." Alex chuckled softly, though his nerves were palpable. He had dreamed of this day for months, imagining every detail, but nothing compared to the real thing. Seeing Natalie, the woman he called his soulmate, moving toward him with a smile that lit up the entire room made every doubt, every fear, dissolve. The ceremony was as perfect as the couple themselves appeared to be. Vows were exchanged, tears were shed, and the sound of applause filled the chapel as Alex and Natalie were pronounced husband and wife. The couple shared a kiss that drew cheers from their guests, their hands tightly clasped as if anchoring themselves to one another amidst the whirlwind of excitement. The reception was held in an opulent ballroom, its vaulted ceilings adorned with glittering chandeliers and walls draped in soft, romantic hues. Tables were decorated with fresh flowers and golden accents, and the air buzzed with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Alex couldn't stop smiling as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and receiving congratulations. He felt invincible, as if nothing in the world could tarnish the perfection of this day. Natalie was by his side, laughing at jokes, thanking guests, and looking every bit the radiant bride. Then came the toasts. Ethan, ever the charismatic best man, took the microphone and launched into a speech that was equal parts humor and heart. "Alex," he began, raising his glass, "you've always been the guy who had everything together. The job, the looks, the charm. And now you've found Natalie, the one thing you were missing, a partner who makes you better in every way. To Alex and Natalie, may your life together be as beautiful as this day." The room erupted in applause, and Alex clinked his glass against Natalie's, their eyes locking in a shared moment of happiness. As the evening wore on, the celebration reached its peak. The dance floor was alive with guests swaying to the music, and Alex found himself pulled into dances with relatives, friends, and even a few overly enthusiastic bridesmaids. It was during one of these dances that Natalie whispered to him, "I'm going to slip upstairs for a moment. I need to freshen up." Alex nodded, distracted by the sheer joy of the moment. "I'll be down here toasting us some more," he joked, earning a soft laugh from her before she slipped away. Unbeknownst to Alex, Ethan had been watching Natalie closely all evening. His easy smile and confident demeanor masked the tension simmering beneath the surface. As Natalie excused herself and disappeared toward the staircase, Ethan hesitated for only a moment before following her, his expression unreadable. Natalie reached the bridal suite, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Closing the door behind her, she leaned against it, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. The day had been perfect. Absolutely perfect. But a nagging feeling of unease gnawed at her. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his grin replaced with something more serious. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "You seemed off earlier." "I'm fine," she said quickly, crossing her arms as if to shield herself. "It's just a lot, you know? The day, the people, the expectations." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to pretend with me, Natalie. I know you." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the air between them grew heavy. Downstairs, Alex was laughing with a group of friends, raising his glass in yet another toast. He glanced toward the staircase occasionally, wondering when Natalie would return. But the warmth of the crowd, the music, and the champagne kept his concerns at bay. Minutes turned to an hour, and still, Natalie and Ethan hadn't returned. Upstairs, the suite was filled with silence, broken only by hushed whispers and the occasional creak of the floorboards. What had begun as a moment of concern was spiraling into something neither Natalie nor Ethan had anticipated. Or perhaps, something they had both feared, yet ignored. Back in the ballroom, Alex excused himself from the group, his smile faltering slightly as he made his way toward the staircase. He told himself it was nothing, that Natalie was probably caught up fixing her hair or chatting with someone. As he climbed the stairs, a faint unease settled in his chest, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. The evening, which had started as the pinnacle of happiness, was about to take a turn neither Alex nor anyone else could have predicted. A perfect beginning, it seemed, could hide the deepest of cracks. And Alex, for all his love and faith in Natalie, was only steps away from a truth that would shatter everything. Natalie sat on the edge of the bed in the bridal suite, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The soft hum of music from downstairs filtered through the walls, a faint reminder of the celebration happening below. She should have felt elated. This was her wedding day, the day she'd dreamed about for years. But instead, her heart was racing, and her mind was a tangled web of thoughts she couldn't unravel. The dress, the flowers, the vows. It had all been perfect, just as everyone had said it would be. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't Alex. He had been everything she could have hoped for: kind, patient, deeply in love. But that was the problem. His love was so unwavering, so pure, that she couldn't help but feel unworthy of it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She froze, expecting Alex, but when she opened it, she found Ethan standing there. "Ethan?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned against the doorframe, his usual cocky grin absent. "You disappeared. I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," she said quickly, stepping back to let him in. "Just needed a moment." He entered the room, his gaze sweeping over her as the door clicked shut behind him. "It's a big day," he said, his tone lighter now. "I get it. All eyes on you, everyone expecting you to be the perfect bride." She let out a hollow laugh, sitting back down on the bed. "It's not just that. It's everything. The pressure, the expectations. It's overwhelming." Ethan sat beside her, keeping just enough distance to make the moment feel safe. "You don't have to pretend with me, Natalie. I know you better than that." That was the thing about Ethan. He had a way of seeing through her defenses, of pulling truths from her that she wasn't ready to face. He had always been a presence in her and Alex's lives, charming and reckless in equal measure. There had been moments in the past, fleeting and unspoken, when she had wondered what might have happened if she'd met Ethan first. "You're lucky," Ethan said after a moment, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Lucky?" she repeated, her brow furrowing. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Alex is a good man, the best, really. He'd do anything for you." "I know," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. Ethan turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers. "Do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. She didn't respond, couldn't respond. Instead, she looked away, her hands fidgeting with the fabric of her dress. "Natalie," Ethan said, his tone shifting. "Are you happy?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. He moved closer, just slightly, enough for her to feel the heat of his presence. "I mean it," he said. "Are you happy? Or are you just doing what everyone expects you to do?" Her breath hitched, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. "I love Alex," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He's everything I ever wanted." "But?" Ethan pressed gently, Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. But sometimes, I feel like I'm not enough for him. Like I'll never be enough. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against hers. That's not true, he said softly. You're more than enough. You're everything. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, or maybe had chosen to ignore. It was dangerous. Ethan, she began, but her voice faltered as he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both tentative and charged. For a moment she froze, her mind screaming at her to stop. But then, something inside her broke, and she kissed him back, her hands clutching at his shirt as though he were the only thing keeping her upright. It was over quickly, too quickly, and yet far too long. When they pulled apart, the room felt like it was spinning. We can't, she whispered, her voice shaking. I know, he said, running a hand through his hair. I know. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither daring to look at the other. This was a mistake, she said finally, her words barely audible. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. It won't happen again. It can't, she said firmly, though her resolve was more for her benefit than his. He stood, smoothing his shirt as he moved toward the door. I'll go, he said, his voice hollow. Enjoy the rest of your night, Natalie. She didn't respond, couldn't bring herself to say anything as he slipped out of the room and closed the door behind him. Alone in the bridal suite, Natalie stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror across the room. Her lipstick was smudged, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and regret. Downstairs, Alex was still toasting their future, blissfully unaware of the betrayal that had just taken place. Natalie pressed her hands to her face, her chest heaving with silent sobs. She had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But she told herself it was just that, a mistake. A moment of weakness that would never happen again. She would bury it, lock it away in a corner of her mind, and move forward as though nothing had happened. But as she smoothed her dress and prepared to return to the reception, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Some mistakes couldn't be erased, and this one, she feared, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The crystal-clear waters of the Maldives stretched endlessly before Alex and Natalie, their villa perched on stilts above the ocean. It was a postcard-perfect setting, the kind of place couples dream of for their honeymoon. For Alex, it was paradise, a celebration of the love he believed would carry them through the rest of their lives. For Natalie, it was a constant battle to suppress the guilt threatening to consume her. They spent their days lounging under the sun, exploring the vibrant coral reefs, and sipping cocktails on their private deck. Alex couldn't stop smiling, his joy radiating with every laugh and affectionate glance he cast toward his new wife. This is perfect, he said one afternoon, reclining in a hammock with Natalie curled up beside him. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else with anyone else. Natalie smiled, though it felt forced. She reached out to touch his face, her fingers lingering on his jawline. You're too good to me, she murmured. You deserve it, he replied, kissing her forehead. The words cut deeper than he could have imagined. She didn't deserve this. His love, his devotion, his unwavering trust. Every moment she spent in his arms felt like a lie, a cruel facade she didn't know how to escape. At night, she clung to him as if trying to convince herself that the closeness would erase the memory of Ethan's touch. She would whisper sweet nothings, trace patterns on his skin, and tell him over and over how much she loved him. I'm the luckiest man alive, Alex said one night, his voice heavy with sleep. Natalie's chest tightened, and she blinked back tears. I love you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Meanwhile, Ethan was doing everything he could to avoid Alex. He ignored calls, brushed off texts, and found excuses to skip their usual hangouts. Alex noticed, of course. "Ethan's been weird lately," he mentioned to Natalie over breakfast one morning. "He hasn't returned my calls since the wedding." Natalie froze, her fork hovering in midair. "Maybe he's just busy," she said quickly. "Maybe," Alex agreed, though his brow furrowed with concern. "Still, it's not like him. I'll stop by his place when we get back." The thought of Alex and Ethan face to face sent a chill down Natalie's spine. She quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward their plans for the day. But the guilt gnawed at her, relentless and unforgiving. As the honeymoon continued, Natalie's behavior grew more erratic. She became hyper-focused on making everything perfect, planning elaborate candlelit dinners, arranging surprise outings, and showering Alex with affection. "You're spoiling me," Alex teased one evening as they dined under the stars. "You deserve it," she replied, echoing his earlier words. He reached across the table to take her hand, his eyes full of love. "I don't need grand gestures, Nat. Just you. That's all I've ever needed." Her smile wavered, and she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her napkin. One afternoon, while Alex was snorkeling, Natalie sat alone on the deck, staring out at the horizon. The guilt was unbearable, a constant weight pressing down on her chest. She had thought the distance from home would help her forget, but instead, it magnified the enormity of what she had done. Ethan's face haunted her thoughts. His touch, his words, the moment she had betrayed everything Alex stood for. She replayed it in her mind like a terrible movie she couldn't turn off. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs racked her body. When Alex returned, dripping wet and full of excitement about the sea turtle he had just seen, she quickly wiped her tears and plastered on a smile. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Of course," she said, standing to wrap her arms around him. "Just missed you." He kissed the top of her head, oblivious to the storm raging within her. By the time the honeymoon ended, Alex was blissfully unaware of the secret hanging over their new marriage. For him, it had been the perfect start to their life together, a dream he was eager to continue building once they returned home. For Natalie, it had been a carefully constructed illusion, a desperate attempt to hold on to a love she didn't deserve. As they boarded the plane back to reality, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully guarded secret was a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, she knew it would destroy everything. The honeymoon glow didn't last long once Alex and Natalie returned home. At first, everything seemed fine, normal even. Natalie fell into her role as the devoted wife, and Alex went back to work, throwing himself into his projects with renewed energy. But over time, small things began to nag at him, little inconsistencies in Natalie's behavior that he couldn't ignore. It started with her mood swings. One evening, Alex came home from work to find Natalie in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a ferocity that seemed unnecessary. "Rough day?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. She jumped slightly, as though she hadn't heard him come in. "No, it's fine," she said quickly, her voice tight. "Just trying to get dinner ready." He moved closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You seem tense." "I'm fine," she snapped, shrugging him off. Then, as if realizing her tone, she softened. "Sorry, I'm just tired." Alex nodded, brushing it off, but the incident lingered in his mind. Then there was her phone. Natalie had always been casual with her phone, leaving it lying around the house or ignoring it altogether during their time together. But now, she seemed glued to it, her screen lighting up with messages she'd quickly swipe away. One night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Alex noticed her texting furiously. "Who's that?" he asked casually, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Claire," she said without hesitation. He nodded, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. The real shift came when Ethan finally resurfaced. Alex hadn't seen or heard much from his best friend since the wedding. At first, he assumed Ethan was busy, but the prolonged silence was unusual. When they finally met for drinks one evening, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ethan seemed distracted, his usual charm dulled. "So, how's married life treating you?" Ethan asked, swirling his beer. Alex smiled. "Great, Natalie's amazing as always." Ethan nodded but didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table. "You've been a ghost lately," Alex said, trying to lighten the mood. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan said quickly, too quickly. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." Alex wanted to press him further, but something in Ethan's demeanor stopped him. It was almost as if he didn't want to be there. The tension between Natalie and Ethan became impossible to ignore during a small gathering at their home. Natalie had insisted on inviting a few close friends over for dinner, a casual evening to catch up and unwind. Among the guests was Lily, a mutual friend who had always been outspoken and perceptive. As the night went on, Alex couldn't help but notice the way Natalie avoided Ethan. She barely looked at him, and when she did, it was with a nervous energy that made Alex's stomach churn. Lily noticed too. "Everything okay with those two?" she asked Alex quietly as they stood by the kitchen island. "What do you mean?" Alex asked, feigning nonchalance. Lily shrugged, sipping her wine. "I don't know, they just seem weird. Like there's some kind of unspoken tension." Alex forced a laugh. "You're imagining things." "Maybe," Lily said, her tone skeptical. "But you know Ethan has a knack for getting himself into trouble. You should keep an eye on him." "What kind of trouble?" Alex asked, his curiosity piqued. Lily hesitated, as though deciding whether to say more. "He's always been reckless. Women, lies, whatever gets him what he wants. I've seen it too many times." Alex waved her off, but Lily's words stayed with him. That night, after the guests had left, Alex found himself sitting alone in the living room, replaying the evening in his mind. Natalie had been unusually quiet, her usual charm replaced by a strained politeness. "Are you coming to bed?" She called from the staircase, her voice breaking his train of thought. "In a minute," he replied, his eyes fixed on the empty wine glass in front of him. As he sat there, doubts began to creep in. Was Lily right? Was he being naive? He didn't want to believe it. Natalie was his wife, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with. But the inconsistencies were piling up. Her evasive answers, the tension with Ethan, the constant presence of her phone. Alex decided then and there that he needed to pay closer attention. He wouldn't accuse her outright, not without proof. But he would observe, quietly and carefully, until he understood what was really going on. Because something was wrong. And deep down, Alex knew that the cracks in their seemingly perfect marriage were only going to grow. It was a chilly Friday evening, and the group had decided to meet at a cozy bar downtown. Alex, Natalie, Ethan, and a handful of close friends gathered around a table cluttered with glasses and bottles. The ambiance was warm, laughter echoing over the soft hum of music and the occasional clink of glass. It felt like old times, or at least Alex wanted it to feel that way. Natalie seemed quieter than usual, though she hid it well behind polite smiles and occasional laughter. Ethan, on the other hand, was on his second drink and showing signs of loosening up. Alex observed them both closely. He hadn't planned to, but his growing suspicions left him unable to look away. He wanted to shake off the nagging thoughts that had been plaguing him for weeks. But something about the dynamic between Natalie and Ethan didn't sit right. As the night wore on, the group began to splinter. Some drifted to the bar for another round, while others engaged in animated conversations about work, relationships, and life. Ethan and Natalie, however, lingered at the table, their voices low. Alex excused himself to the restroom, but when he returned, he paused just out of sight. Their conversation carried over the noise, the words cutting through the chatter like a knife. "I told you we shouldn't have let it happen," Natalie whispered harshly, her tone a mix of anger and regret. It was a mistake, Ethan replied, his voice slurred from the alcohol. But it's not like I forced you, Natalie. You wanted it too. Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Natalie's voice dropped even lower, but Alex strained to hear. If he ever finds out? He won't, Ethan interrupted, his tone dismissive. Not unless you tell him. Alex stepped back, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they created was one he didn't want to see. He clenched his fists, struggling to steady his breathing as he re-entered the bar, pretending he hadn't heard anything. The ride home was tense. Natalie sat beside Alex, staring out the window as if the passing streetlights could shield her from his silence. He hadn't said much since leaving the bar, and the weight of the unspoken words hung heavy between them. When they reached the house, Alex unlocked the door and stepped inside, tossing his keys onto the counter. Natalie followed hesitantly, her movements slow and uncertain. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice tentative. Alex turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes searching hers for any sign of guilt or remorse. What were you and Ethan talking about tonight? He asked finally, his tone calm but sharp. Natalie's eyes widened and she took a step back. What do you mean? I heard you, he said, his voice rising slightly. I heard what you said about a mistake, about something I wasn't supposed to find out. So tell me, Natalie, what happened? Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands trembling. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me, Alex snapped, slamming his hand onto the counter. What happened between you and Ethan? The room fell silent except for the sound of Natalie's shallow breathing. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally looked at him, her lips quivering. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What happened? Alex demanded, his voice breaking. She took a shaky breath, her tears falling freely now. On our wedding night, while you were downstairs, Ethan came to the suite. We were talking and I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake, Alex. I swear it was a mistake. Alex staggered back as if she had physically struck him. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, cutting deeper with each passing second. You were with him, he said, his voice hollow. On our wedding night. Natalie nodded, sobbing into her hands. I'm so sorry, Alex. I don't know why I did it. I was scared, overwhelmed. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please, you have to believe me. I love you. It didn't mean anything. Alex stared at her, his chest heaving as he tried to process the betrayal. His mind replayed every moment from their wedding day, every smile, every promise, every kiss, now tainted by her confession. You love me, he said bitterly, his voice shaking. You love me, and yet you did this? With my best friend? It was a mistake, she repeated, her voice desperate. It meant nothing. Please, Alex, don't let this ruin us. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. Ruin us? Natalie, you ruined us the moment you let him touch you. You ruined everything. Her sobs grew louder, but Alex couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He felt like a stranger in his own home, like the ground beneath him had been ripped away. I need to go, he said suddenly, his voice cold. Alex, please, she began, reaching for him. He stepped back, his expression hard. Don't. I can't even look at you right now. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, leaving Natalie alone in the empty house. Alex drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring as tears filled his eyes. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the betrayal she had confessed. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he let out a guttural scream. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight that left him gasping for air. He had built his life around Natalie. trusted her with everything he had. And now it felt like his entire world had been torn apart. As the sun began to rise, Alex sat in his car staring blankly at the horizon. He didn't know what to do or where to go. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him, the morning sunlight creeping through the blinds of his apartment. He hadn't slept. Not really. The weight of what he'd done haunted him, the memories replaying in his mind like a cruel loop. The sweet, Natalie's tearful eyes, the overwhelming guilt he'd felt even as he walked away. He ran a hand over his face, groaning. The wedding had been a disaster of his own making, and now the consequences were beginning to take shape. He hadn't intended for things to spiral this way. He had always been the reckless one, the charmer who pushed boundaries. But this was a line he should never have crossed. He'd avoided Alex as much as possible since the wedding, dodging calls and making excuses. The night out at the bar had been a mistake. He shouldn't have gone. He'd let his guard down, and the alcohol had loosened his tongue enough to give Alex a glimpse of the truth. And now, it was only a matter of time before the fallout caught up to him. Work was no escape. Ethan sat in his office, staring blankly at the spreadsheet on his computer. Numbers blurred together, meaningless as his thoughts spiraled. His usual charm and wit had vanished, replaced by a distracted, irritable demeanor that his colleagues couldn't help but notice. "You okay, man?" his coworker Jeff asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, fine," Ethan replied curtly, not even glancing up. Jeff frowned but didn't press further, leaving Ethan to stew in his guilt. Every email, every phone call, every meeting felt like a Herculean effort. The guilt consumed him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. He'd tried drowning it out with drinks, late nights, and empty conversations, but nothing worked. Because at the end of the day, the one person he couldn't escape was himself. When Alex showed up unannounced at Ethan's apartment, it wasn't a surprise, but it still sent a jolt of panic through him. Ethan opened the door hesitantly, his face pale as he met Alex's hard, unreadable expression. "Hey," Ethan began, his voice shaky. "What's up?" "We need to talk," Alex said flatly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ethan closed the door, his heart pounding as Alex walked into the living room. "Look, man," Ethan started, trying to sound casual. "If this is about—" "Don't," Alex snapped, his voice sharp. "Don't try to play this off like it's nothing." Ethan froze, his stomach sinking. "Alex, I know," Alex interrupted, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I know what happened. Natalie told me everything." Ethan's face crumpled, the weight of his guilt crashing down on him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said desperately. "It was a mistake. I was drunk. She was overwhelmed. It just happened." Alex laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "It just happened? That's your excuse? On my wedding night, while I was downstairs toasting our future, you were upstairs betraying me with my wife." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I swear, Alex, I never wanted to hurt you." "Don't you dare say you're sorry," Alex spat, stepping closer. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase what you did." Ethan raised his hands defensively, his voice pleading. "I know I screwed up, okay? I know I ruined everything, but it didn't mean anything. It was a stupid one-time mistake." Alex's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "It meant something to me," he said coldly. "It meant everything to me. You weren't just my best friend, you were my brother. And you threw it all away for what? A moment of weakness?" The tension in the room was palpable, both men teetering on the edge of an explosion. "You think I don't hate myself for this?" Ethan shouted suddenly, his voice cracking. "I've been living with this guilt every damn day. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't change what happened." Alex's eyes burned with fury. "You're right. You don't deserve my forgiveness. And you sure as hell don't deserve to be a part of my life anymore. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Alex took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear from you. And if you ever come near Natalie again, I swear to God, Ethan, you'll regret it. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Alex didn't give him the chance. You're dead to me, Alex said, his voice trembling with finality. Without another word, Alex turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Ethan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The silence in the apartment was deafening, the weight of Alex's words pressing down on him like a physical force. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the damage he had caused. He had destroyed not just a friendship, but a bond that had been a cornerstone of his life. And for what? A fleeting moment of weakness that had cost him everything. He sat there for hours, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He thought about Alex's anger, Natalie's guilt, and the trust he had shattered. For the first time, Ethan realized that there was no easy way out of this. No charm or wit could fix what he had broken. If he ever wanted to make amends, it wouldn't be for Alex or Natalie. It would be for himself. Because at the end of the day, the only way to move forward was to face the truth and start rebuilding from the rubble he had created. The days following Alex's departure from their home were the darkest Natalie had ever experienced. The silence in the house was deafening, each passing moment a painful reminder of her betrayal and the destruction it had caused. She wandered through the rooms aimlessly, haunted by the weight of Alex's absence. She had hoped her apologies and tears would be enough to start repairing the damage, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Words meant nothing without action, and if she truly wanted to rebuild herself, she needed to start from within. It was Claire, her oldest friend, who suggested therapy. I don't know what to do, Natalie admitted one afternoon, her voice trembling as she held her coffee mug tightly. I've ruined everything. Alex won't even look at me, and I can't blame him. Claire placed a hand on her shoulder. Nat, you can't fix this overnight, but you need to start with yourself. You've been carrying so much guilt, and it's not something you can unpack alone. Therapy could help. The idea made Natalie nervous. Therapy felt like an admission of failure, of being fundamentally broken. But as the days dragged on, she realized that she couldn't face her demons alone. The following week, she scheduled her first session. Sitting across from Dr. Ayers, a kind-eyed woman with a calming voice, Natalie felt exposed but oddly hopeful. What brings you here, Natalie? Dr. Ayers asked gently. Natalie took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I've made mistakes, she began. Horrible, unforgivable mistakes. I hurt the person I love the most, and now I don't even recognize myself. Over the next few sessions, Natalie unpacked the layers of her guilt and insecurity. She talked about the overwhelming pressure of the wedding, her fleeting feelings of inadequacy compared to Alex's unwavering devotion, and the moment of weakness that led to her betrayal. I felt like I wasn't enough, she admitted one day, her voice breaking. Alex is so perfect, and I let my own insecurities convince me that I didn't deserve him. Dr. Ayers nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes when we feel unworthy, we sabotage the things that mean the most to us, but recognizing that is the first step toward healing. The sessions were emotionally draining but cathartic. Slowly, Natalie began to understand the patterns and fears that had driven her actions. She learned to take accountability without letting guilt consume her, and she started to see the possibility of growth, even amidst the wreckage. One evening, after a particularly intense therapy session, Natalie sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. Dr. Ayers had suggested writing a letter to Alex, not to send immediately, but as a way to organize her thoughts and express her feelings honestly. For hours, she stared at the blank page, the words swirling in her mind but refusing to settle. Finally, she began to write. Dear Alex, I don't even know where to begin. Every time I think about what I've done, I feel like the ground has been ripped out from beneath me. I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and for that, I am so deeply sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I need you to know how much I regret my actions. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand why I did what I did. It doesn't excuse my behavior, but it's helping me confront the insecurities and fears that led me to hurt you. For so long, I let my doubts and inadequacies fester, and instead of facing them, I ran from them, and from you. You deserved better, Alex. You still do. You've always been the best part of my life, and I threw it away because I was too scared to confront my own flaws. I hate myself for that, but I'm working to become better. Not for you, but for myself. Because I can't live with the person I've become. I don't know if we'll ever find our way back to each other, and I won't blame you if we don't. All I want is for you to know that I love you. I always have, and I always will. Whatever happens, I hope you find happiness, even if it's without me. Take all the time you need. I'll be here if you ever want to talk. With love, Natalie. When she finished, her hands were trembling and tears blurred her vision. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in an envelope she didn't yet seal. It wasn't the right time to give it to him, but knowing it existed gave her a strange sense of peace. With Dr. Ayer's guidance, Natalie made the difficult decision to give Alex the space he needed. It was tempting to call him, to beg him to come home, but she knew that wouldn't help. If Alex ever decided to forgive her, it had to be on his terms. She threw herself into self-improvement, attending therapy regularly, volunteering at a local shelter, and focusing on small acts of kindness that helped her feel connected to something bigger than herself. For the first time in years, she began to feel like she was rediscovering who she was. Not the perfect bride, not the guilty wife, but simply Natalie. Weeks turned into months, and while the ache of Alex's absence never fully faded, Natalie found herself growing stronger. She didn't know if he would ever return, but she had stopped defining her worth by his forgiveness. One afternoon, as she was tidying up the house, she came across a framed photo from their honeymoon. In the picture, Alex was laughing, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking carefree and happy. She smiled sadly, tracing her finger over his face. "I hope you're okay," she whispered. For the first time, the thought didn't fill her with despair. Instead, it gave her a sense of calm. Natalie wasn't the woman Alex had married. Not anymore. But maybe, just maybe, she could become someone he'd want to know again. And if not, she could live with that too. Alex arrived at his older brother Ryan's home with nothing more than a duffel bag of clothes and a heavy heart. Ryan lived in a quiet suburb, far enough from the chaos of the city and the haunting memories of Alex's house. As he stepped into the cozy, lived-in home, Alex was greeted with a warm hug from Ryan, who had always been the steady, reliable figure in his life. "You're staying as long as you need," Ryan said firmly, grabbing the bag from Alex's hand. "This is your home now." Alex nodded silently, grateful for the refuge but unsure if any place could feel like home again. The first few days were the hardest. Alex spent most of his time on Ryan's couch, alternating between staring blankly at the television and scrolling aimlessly through his phone. Ryan gave him space but made sure he wasn't alone for too long, bringing over beers or sitting beside him in companionable silence. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Ryan finally broached the topic Alex had been avoiding. "You know, I've been where you are," Ryan said, setting his fork down. Alex looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Before I met Sarah, there was someone else. We were together for years, and I thought she was the one. Then I found out she'd been cheating on me." Alex stared at him, stunned. "You never told me that." Ryan shrugged. "Didn't seem important at the time, but now, I think you need to hear it." "What happened?" Alex asked hesitantly. Ryan took a deep breath. It broke me for a while. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I kept asking myself what I did wrong, what I could have done differently. But eventually, I realized that her choices weren't about me. They were about her. And the only way I could move forward was to focus on myself. Alex absorbed his brother's words, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. With Ryan's encouragement, Alex started taking small steps toward healing. He began running every morning, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. The early morning air, crisp and cool, became his sanctuary, a place where he could clear his mind and release the anger and pain that had been weighing him down. At Ryan's suggestion, Alex also started journaling. It felt strange at first, putting his thoughts onto paper, but over time, it became a therapeutic outlet. He wrote about his pain, his confusion, and his hopes for the future. Some entries were filled with raw, unfiltered anger, while others were quieter, reflecting on the lessons he was beginning to learn. "I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who kept a journal," Alex admitted to Ryan one evening. Ryan smiled. "It's not about being a journal guy. It's about getting the thoughts out of your head. Trust me, it helps." One afternoon, Alex received a text from Lily, a mutual friend who had been a quiet presence throughout his ordeal. "Hey, haven't seen you in a while. Want to grab coffee?" Alex hesitated before responding. He hadn't been great at staying in touch with anyone since the fallout with Natalie, but Lily had always been someone he could count on. "Sure. Tomorrow?" The next day, they met at a small cafe near Ryan's house. Lily greeted him with a warm smile, her concern evident in her eyes. "You look better," she said after they sat down. "Thanks," Alex replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. They talked about everything and nothing: work, hobbies, mutual friends. Lily listened without judgment as Alex hesitantly shared bits and pieces of what he was going through. "She's trying to change," Lily said carefully, referring to Natalie. "I've seen her. She's different." Alex tensed, but Lily held up a hand. "I'm not saying you have to forgive her. I just thought you should know." He nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he admitted. "But I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Lily smiled gently. "That's all you can do." As weeks turned into months, Alex found himself rediscovering parts of himself he had forgotten. He threw himself into his work, taking on new projects and responsibilities that reignited his passion for his career. He joined a local running group where he met people who didn't know about his past, allowing him to forge new connections without the weight of his history. Through it all, Ryan remained his steadfast support, offering advice when needed and space when he didn't. One evening, as they sat on the porch with beers in hand, Ryan turned to Alex and said, "You know, you've come a long way." Alex looked out at the setting sun, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I have." Though the pain of Natalie's betrayal hadn't entirely faded, Alex was beginning to see a path forward. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear, but it was his. He didn't know what the future held, whether he'd reconcile with Natalie, move on entirely, or find peace in solitude. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of control over his life. And for now, that was enough. Months had passed since Alex had walked out of the house he once called home. He had built a new routine, one that didn't include Natalie or the weight of their broken marriage. But despite his efforts to move forward, there were still moments when the past would sneak up on him. A fleeting memory, a familiar scent, or a song that once held meaning. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, as Alex sat at his desk flipping through emails, that a message from Natalie appeared. Subject: "Can we talk?" Alex hesitated before opening it. His heart thudded as he read the brief but careful words. "Hi, Alex. I hope you're doing well. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I've been working on myself and wanted to ask if we could meet. I don't expect anything from you, just a chance to talk. If you're willing, let me know." For a long moment, Alex stared at the screen, his emotions tangled. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to leave her words unanswered. But another part of him, the part that still yearned for clarity, felt compelled to see her, if only to close this chapter once and for all. They met at a small cafe, one Alex had never been to before. He arrived early, his nerves fraying as he sat with a coffee he didn't touch. When Natalie walked in, he barely recognized her. She looked different, simpler almost. Her hair was tied back, her makeup minimal, and her once flashy attire replaced by a plain sweater and jeans. There was a humility in her demeanor that caught Alex off guard. "Hi," she said softly, standing awkwardly by the table. "Hi," Alex replied, gesturing for her to sit. For a moment, they sat in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Natalie spoke. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice steady but low. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't," Alex admitted, his tone even. She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I understand. I don't deserve your time, but I needed to say a few things." Alex leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Go ahead." Natalie took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent the past few months trying to figure out who I am and how I became the person who hurt you. I've been in therapy, volunteering, doing everything I can to be better, not just for you, but for myself." She hesitated, her voice faltering. "I know I can never undo what I did. I know I broke your trust, and I hate myself for it. But I wanted you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I've changed. And I'm still changing." Alex's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said quickly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "I know I don't have the right to ask that of you. I needed you to know how sorry I am. Truly, deeply sorry. And I needed to thank you." "Thank me," Alex said, his voice laced with disbelief. Natalie nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "For walking away, for forcing me to face myself. It hurt, but it was the wake-up call I needed." Silence fell between them again, but this time it felt different, softer, less charged. "I don't know what you want me to say," Alex said finally, his voice quiet. "I don't want you to say anything," Natalie replied. "I just wanted to give you closure, if that's something you need, and to let you know that no matter what you decide, I'll respect it." Alex studied her, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, sorrow, and something he couldn't quite name. This was the moment he had imagined so many times, her admitting her mistakes, owning up to her actions. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked after a long pause. Natalie nodded without hesitation. "Yes, but it's not easy, and it's not quick. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm willing to keep trying." Alex looked down at his coffee, his mind racing. He had two choices: to leave the past behind and move forward alone, or to consider the possibility of rebuilding something that had once been beautiful. When he looked back up, Natalie was watching him, her expression hopeful but resigned. She wasn't begging or pleading, just waiting, willing to accept whatever decision he made. "I need time," Alex said finally. "I don't know what I want right now, but thank you for saying what you needed to say." Natalie smiled faintly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Take all the time you need." As Alex left the cafe, the weight on his chest felt lighter, though the path ahead remained unclear. For the first time in months, he felt the possibility of healing, not just for himself, but maybe, just maybe, for them both. The weeks following Alex's meeting with Natalie were a whirlwind of introspection. He replayed their conversation countless times, weighing her words and the sincerity in her eyes. For months, he had carried anger like a shield, protecting himself from the pain of her betrayal. But now, Something inside him was shifting. He stood at a crossroads: forgiveness or finality. If Alex chose forgiveness, it wasn't an easy decision. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging the pain and choosing to move forward despite it. He and Natalie agreed to start fresh, not as the couple they had once been, but as two people willing to rebuild from the ground up. They took things slow, meeting for coffee or walks in the park, focusing on honest conversations rather than sweeping declarations of love. Alex set boundaries, and Natalie respected them, understanding that trust wasn't something she could demand. It was something she had to earn. Their journey wasn't without setbacks. There were moments of doubt and lingering hurt, but each step forward felt like a victory. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by a cautious hope. One evening, as they sat on a bench watching the sunset, Alex reached for Natalie's hand. "We'll never be the same," he said quietly. Natalie nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know, but maybe we can be something better." For the first time in a long time, Alex smiled. If Alex decided to move on, it was a choice made with clarity, not bitterness. He realized that forgiveness didn't always mean reconciliation. It could also mean letting go. He focused on his newfound independence, embracing the freedom to define his life on his own terms. His mornings began with runs through the neighborhood, the rhythmic pounding of his feet grounding him in the present. His evenings were filled with journaling, reflecting on the lessons he had learned and the person he was becoming. With time, the pain of Natalie's betrayal dulled, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He didn't wish her ill, but he no longer carried the weight of her actions. One evening, as he sat on Ryan's porch with a glass of wine, Alex felt a strange sense of contentment. The horizon stretched out before him, endless and full of promise. "To the future," he murmured, raising his glass in a quiet toast. Whether Alex chose to forgive or move on, the final scene was one of reflection and hope. He stood on the threshold of a new chapter, his heart lighter than it had been in months.